are and experience meaningful involvement on campus and in the community. We work really hard to create a sense of community and belonging for all students on campus. So through programs like these, such as the screening of this film, Warrior Lawyers, Defenders of Sacred Justice, this film focuses on the stories of Native American lawyers, tribal judges, colleagues, and their colleagues who work with Native nations and their citizens to achieve sacred justice. We're hosting this screening to honor Native American Heritage Month this November. So thank you all for being here and for waiting. We're going to get this film started real soon. But we have a filmmaker here, Ms. Audrey Dyer. And then also Mr. Fred Baker, attorney, lawyer. He's also featured in the film. So they're going to stick around for the Q&A afterwards. So as you watch the film, think of some questions you can ask. They'll be around for answers. And then we'll also be filming, but we're trying to keep you guys off camera, so we don't have to do like any kind of disclosure agreements. But this is just to make the program more accessible to people who couldn't be here. So yes, and then bathrooms are down there. Snacks are right here. Feel free to have some. Super important. Just keep your mask on. If you're not snacking, if you are, so if you're done, just put it back on just for safety. And then yeah, then we'll have a small evaluation at the end. Some of that QR code. But I'll make sure I get you guys to fill that out. All good. I was gonna say any questions, but this isn't a class. Are we good with all that? Okay. So I'm gonna queue up the film. I guess I should have did that before I got up. And we'll get started. It's about an hour long.
I'm just gonna like put this on the screen.
John, may I ask a question?
Absolutely.
Is this being live streamed now or will it be streamed later?
So we're gonna. You want to answer that?
Oh, so our plan is because he's gonna be sending out a link for people to watch on their own. So when that link is so while we're watching, we'll have this camera off and we'll just kind of show a screen saying like, please go to this link to watch on your own. That's pretty much the plan.
And then when the questions start.
Yeah, then we'll take.
Yeah, then we'll start recording.
So it is?
I sent them
affair documentaries that tell stories of individuals and communities underrepresented in media. We vulnerable and invisible in American society. Many of Vision's documentaries have aired nationally on PBS, have been distributed to the educational home video markets, and disseminated through wide-sweeping community engagement campaigns. Warrior Lawyers is Vision's second Native American documentary. First was Our Fire Still Burn, released in 2013. Audrey graduated with a BA in Film Studies from the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor, has a master's degree in social work in NYU. And then Mr. Fred Baker. There's a lot here. I'm gonna read it first. Okay, so Frederick M. Baker Jr. has enjoyed a distinguished and varied career. He served for over 8 years as a commissioner of the Michigan Supreme Court. After nearly 2 decades as a partner at one of Michigan's leading law firms, Hogneman, Miller, Schwartz, and Kahn, where he was a trial and appellate litigator. He began the practice of law at Willingham and Co. PC after 3 years as an assistant professor at TM Cooley Law School, where he taught contracts, civil procedures, and legal writing and research. Before that, he served as a law clerk to the late Chief Judge of the Michigan Court of Appeals, Robert J. Donhoff, after serving as a pre-hearing attorney in the Court of Appeals Research Division. He began his career as an instructor of law at Wayne Law School, where he taught legal writing, research, and advocacy. He has also taught as an adjunct professor both insurance and conflicts of law at TM Cooley Law School and insurance and no-fault insurance at Michigan State University College of Law. And there's so much more, but he's a great person. I'm sure he'll share it with us. And I believe you're also part of the film as well. We'll turn to you guys panelists. So you guys just feel free to ask some questions. But I'll kick this off with the questions to you, Audrey. Sort of, what was your trajectory filmmaking? You were social work. And what kind of led you to making films about indigenous communities, or I guess what moved you to make films about underrepresented people?
That's an excellent question. My interest started back in undergrad. I'm gonna take my mask off since we're kind of far away, and I've been vaccinated. My interest started back in undergraduate school at UM. I got my BA in film video studies. I just, as I took some classes there, I just really fell in love with media and documentaries, which I always had an interest in. Just became even more important to me as I learned the craft and the skills of how to do it. And eventually I went on to get a master's in social work to kind of complement my work, because I always had an interest in social affairs and underrepresented populations and social justice, that kind of thing. And so I found that by combining the two, I was able to take it to a different level. So I kind of was able to, have this somewhat of an expert vantage point with my social work background combined with, my interest in documentary production. And then eventually I started a nonprofit as a way to be able to apply for grants and make it a bit more manageable to actually get a project funded, because that's, of course, the most challenging thing. And so after I started my nonprofit about 14 years ago, I met Warren Petoskey, who did the music for the documentary. And he's a Native American who is an activist and storyteller and very involved in issues around the boarding schools. And I realized after, I spoke with him that I knew very little about Native American issues. And so I decided, I'm going to do my next project on that. So that was kind of how that came about, where I really decided to do two documentaries on Native American issues. I mean, and they're, I would say they're the most underrepresented population in the media. And so there's so much to be told about them. I mean, I'll do a couple more projects on Native American issues, and they're just, the themes are endless, really, because there's so little that's been done. And anyway, so that's kind of in a nutshell. Gerard.
Can I add something to what Audrey said, because she's being, in a way, a little too humble. I think what drives the trajectory of her work is very deep humanity and a very deep sympathy with the people that she's studied. I've watched Audrey since I think it was 2015 when we began this project, if I'm correct, 6 years.
Yes.
I've watched her scramble for funding. I've tried to help her
Yes,
find
yeah.
funding. And I've watched the singular determination with which she has pursued the goal of projecting on this screen what you saw tonight. And I've seen it in her early versions and rough cuts, and I've seen how she has built the fact and told what is to me a very touching story. My friend who put me in a path that led us to me was a man named John Wilker. He wrote a book called Anatomy of a Murder, which made him independent of his profession. He was a lawyer, he was a prosecutor, he was a justice of the Supreme Court, and when that book hit the first #1 on the bestseller list in 1960, he resigned from the court after being reelected so that the governor could appoint his successor. But he resigned to write. And one of the books he wrote was one called Laughing Whitefish, which is a true story. He embroidered it a little bit. Her name, for example, was Black Carp, but he thought Laughing Whitefish was a little more poetic. But she was the daughter, by the second wife, of Margie Caboggum, who was an Indian person who led 5 white men to the Jackson mine. They wanted to know where was this rich deposit of ore, where compasses didn't work. It was the purest ore on the face of the earth. And they promised him shares in this mine if he would show them where this was. And of course they broke their promise. And she found this promise among his things after he died, an alcoholic, a common fate for Indian men at that time. And she found a lawyer who enforced the promise. It took 3 trips to the Supreme Court in the 1880s. We don't really know what became of her fully, but she did finally collect on this promise. And I met John through fly fishing. I got the chance to meet him, and he would invite us back. The first time my friend Rich Vanderveen and I met him, his last words were, "Come back, lads, but not too soon." And over the next 9, 10 years of his life, the end of his life, until he died, we became friends, and we started a foundation in his name. This film was made, is dedicated to his memory, and almost every person in this film was either on our scholarship committee. He said, "I want you to create a scholarship, and I want you to help Native Americans go to law school." And that's what we did. And we've done this for over 30 years. And 34 students we've assisted. And Joanne Cook and Ellen Maldonado and Terry Gutman and John Petoskey, all of these people that you see are people we helped go to law school. Because this was what John wanted to do. He had a profound sense of the injustice that has been done to many people. And so, for us, at the Wilker Foundation, we just raise the money, and the Committee of Native Americans, our scholarship committee, decides who gets it, who's eligible, and so forth, because we're white people. But we feel very good about what has been accomplished by the people that John told us to help. And I feel very good when I see that Audrey has succeeded in telling this story. And it's been a privilege to watch her work. The deep sense of empathy, sympathy, and fellow feeling that you have for the people you've worked with to make their fires still burn. And the fact that they let you come back and make this one, the controversy that generated, tells me that your humanity is really realized at the base of the trajectory of the working. My hat is off to you.
Thank you, Fred. I think he summed it up quite well. I mean, I think he said it much better than I, but he gave a nice history too of how this film originated, you know, through my meeting people at the Wilker Foundation and trying to, you know, bring about an understanding of what they do for their tribal communities on a daily basis and the challenges they face and the successes they've had. And the importance really of attorneys in Native American communities. I mean, they are kind of the movers and shakers, I think, because so much, like Joanne said, deals with law and issues of justice and treaty rights and historical trauma. They all kind of, I mean, one of the major professions that can kind of change some of the harms of the past and make inroads to the future is, I think, law. And most of us, I think, have negative views of lawyers. I mean, you know, especially you see in politics that most politicians are attorneys. And I don't know, for me, it was such an honor to be able to tell their story and hear about what they do on a daily basis, because it opens up a whole other world of what law is capable of and what, you know, lawyers and judges and the colleagues they work with, how they can empower people and their communities and make real change in public policy. So anyway, any other questions, or even if you want to share, you know, your thoughts about some of the topics, how they struck you, if there's things you just had no idea about and you're learning for the first time, for example.
Have you worked with Kay McGowan at all by chance?
Kay McGowan?
McGowan, yes.
You know, I know of her.
I have not 2 or 3 I've seen, so I'll pull it out then also. I'm sorry, I'm a mole and also I'm triple vets, so I'll keep this confidential. Sorry.
I know her and I've met her, but I haven't worked directly with her. You know, I may have reached out to her for Our Fires Still Burn, but you know, when you reach out to different people for interviews, you know, for whatever various reasons, it just, may not come to fruition. But yeah, she's a really important figure in Native American, Michigan's Native American community. Yes.
Also, I'm gonna ask, what are you working on currently what are you working on currently? What's on the horizon?
I'm actually fundraising for my next project on Native Americans. I'm going to, if you recollect, there was the tribal peacemaking. There was like 2 chapters on that, and how they're using peacemaking in, you know, mainstream, like in some of the state courts. You're seeing it in, like in Ann Arbor. So what I want to do is I want to do a 30-minute piece on those chapters, like expand them and get in more in depth on what tribal peacemaking is, how it can be utilized, not only in, you know, in other tribal communities, but in mainstream society, really, because there's so much to offer there, and it's it can really help combat so many societal ills, especially in the criminal justice system and in the court system. I mean, you know, there's the percentage of, you know, Native Americans and minorities that, you know, are imprisoned over particularly let's say non-violent offenses. You know, there's so much that can be remedied so that they don't end up just being funneled there, you know, and a solution that really ultimately, I think, can benefit the offender and bring their life in, you know, down a different pathway, as well as the people harmed, so that there's more healing. I mean, prison doesn't always, take away the pain and the hurt and other feelings that are connected with, you know, being victimized. So anyway, I think there's just a lot of room for use of peacemaking, and it's those chapters. I found that some of my audience members really really it resonates with them, and they point that out, like, oh, those peacemaking chapters were, you know, really significant to me. So it kind of planted that idea in my head that I would, you know, just look at that more in depth and do a 30-minute project, so that maybe instead of an hour project, so that maybe it could be utilized more in the school system, because, you know, it's hard to, you know, they don't have time in high school and, you know, public, you know, middle school to show a longer piece, and I just think it might allow it to be more versatile. So, thank you for your questions.
Yes, I'm not sure I can really formulate any other cogent questions this evening, but yeah, thank you both for your work, and thank you for facilitating this. So thank you.
Yes, thank you, and thank you for coming. Anybody else have any?
I was gonna chime in and say, so I first heard about restorative justice through an AmeriCorps program that
Okay.
I work for. So we would start off with like a circle, kind of like open and close, but it was also the way that we dealt with conflict whenever it arose within the group. And it was, I had no idea. I mean, well, I heard someone say like this is based off of like Native principles and practices, but I didn't understand that it was like straight up connection like that. Because they were like, we didn't follow it kind of to the T the way that they obviously laid out, but both people had to agree that they wanted to do it, and it was just open dialogue, and both parties came to the decision of like how do we resolve this, like what the solution look like to you, what does it look like to you.
Yes.
So that's how I even first became aware of like restorative practices, restorative justice at all, through an AmeriCorps program that I did. So it was just interesting. I was just like, oh, like look, this is where this came from.
Right.
Just to me, that's like really beautiful. kind of getting back to like our roots, like of this country.
Just a little sidelight, a man who has become very dear to me, Justice Michael F. Kavanaugh, who was a justice of the Michigan Supreme Court when he was Chief Justice, became friends with Michael Putaski. I was chairing a committee that oversees the publication of state bar publications. We had an issue in which we had a series of issues in which we profiled leaders. And I chose Michael Putaski as the person to interview, and I got to know him at about the same time Justice Kavanaugh did. And I went up and interviewed him, and he took me on a tour of what had been accomplished at that time, in just 10 or 12 years after being federally recognized. The two of them became very closely associated and worked together to create respect and communication between the tribal courts, which are the courts of sovereign entities. These tribes are sovereign, they are nations. And to enhance the, I'll call it cross-pollination for lack of a better term. And it was this relationship that began a larger movement that has blossomed into Tim O'Connor in the Washington Circuit adopting this as a former part of their program, as an alternative path. It has taken the goodwill of people on both sides of this state-tribal divide to join together to create programs like this. And I'm very hopeful that other circuits who are looking into this will adopt similar programs. The difference between a punitive approach and a restorative approach is in those words, punitive. All you do when you take an eye for an eye and a tooth for tooth is to be blind and toothless. But if you restore, you're restoring not just that person, you're restoring the victim who has a chance to convey to the person who's harmed that victim the harm that's been done. You give an opportunity for amends and for apology. And you allow a family to become involved if there is a family in the restoration of that person to membership in a community, whether it's a tribal community or just a regular community that we're familiar with. And just as it restores a culture, it can restore a sense of belonging and a sense of community in the state court system. So there's a lot of potential there to do much more than simply punishing accomplishments.
Can I ask another question to everyone? Is that okay?
Go for it, you're
So-
asking good questions.
So I guess what are barriers to us having a larger, I guess, restorative system, or one that's less punitive, one that's less, like you said, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, like?
I'd say for-profit prisons probably.
Rachel says for-profit prisons are a barrier, but what do you guys?
You're masked, so I think I heard the question. What are the barriers? Yeah.
And Rachel said for-profit prisons.
For-profit.
Money,
Yeah.
the greed, lawyers
Power.
who want fees, judges who are inflexible,
wanna keep-
racism
yeah.
might be involved there somewhere.
Hey,
I think there are
Yes.
very often, if you have money, you can make the system work for you. If you don't have money, you will be ground up by the system. There's a wonderful song that goes, we all want justice, but you have to have the money to buy it. You have to be fool to close your eyes and deny it. And a lot of poor people walking the streets of my town who are too blind to see that justice is used to do them right now. And that unfortunately so.
Yes.
The system does have people within it, and Judge O'Connor is one of them. Tim O'Connor. I like to think I'm one. And there are many who see more important goals than grinding the system and grinding out fees and having power over a satrapy of foster homes. I've seen terrible things done by probate judges who just like seem to enjoy nothing so much as power. These are the obstacles that have to be overcome, and they can be overcome by people who care
I mean,
about
yes,
outcomes.
yes, well said. I think that, I mean, part of my hope is with a project like this, that people begin to be educated that this exists. You know, that these options, these pathways do exist. I mean, because unless you know that, you know, I mean, it's like someone who has been, stuck in poverty, like a child or an adolescent in a city somewhere, and that's all they see, and that's how they are treated, and they are, and they often feel victimized, and they don't have another worldview. All they know is that, I mean, unless they're watching TV, and then of course they see people with, mansions and cars and big, so and that makes them feel even worse, but they just too often just know their neighborhood, or, they're trying to survive, the gang on the, corner that they have to get through to go to school. And so, if people don't know that there are actually other options or ways of life, I mean, then you don't even know you can, well, at least aim or have that in your mind that exists. It doesn't mean it's, it's far from easy to get out of a situation like that unless you are helped. And so if you have more people that know these things exist and are pulled towards maybe having a career in these kinds of areas, like like one woman in there was saying, she helped this, large family that the kids were taken from them and they were poor, and there, maybe there was drug abuse involved, but they were assisted over like a 1.5 year period of time by many professionals in a peacemaking format to come through that and have housing and to resolve, other kinds of complicated issues that were going on with the family. So, I mean, there are people that will never adopt it. I mean, there are people that, like Fred was saying, love power. They use the system as their, is where, their money comes from. Judge Connors had mentioned that he had originally been a litigator. And, his money is based on conflict, and it's certainly not about resolving that conflict in a peacemaking way. So, but I think the more people that can take up, I guess, this way of living, this approach to life, I think that there'll be more avenues for healing and hope. So, but it's not an easy, change is not easy. Anybody else?
I think it's also kind of like important to be educated, about these topics. I think this film is a good example. A lot of stuff you talk about, basically everything. It was my first time hearing about it, especially like.
Can you? Yeah.
A lot of stuff you talked about, it was my first time hearing about it, and I definitely think like educating yourself on these types of topics is important, especially like when we're talking about power positions. We were talking about it in my sociology class. Like you often kind of view what you have around you, and you view what's above you. You don't necessarily always think about what might be below you or what might things that might be worse than you. So I definitely think that in a situation like this, one of the first steps to really taking action towards these kinds of issues is knowing about them and educating yourself about them. Because, you know, it's just not a common thing, especially like it's not common to see in like schools or like any like really power system. It's not really common to hear about the misfortunes that the Native American people have to go through. So I definitely think that it's, you know, very cool that you put like such a powerful production that really brought light to like a lot of issues that weren't discussed and that really do need to be discussed in a lot of important conversations.
Thank you for that, yes. If you end up going into video, you know, into production or whatever, you know, it's something to keep in mind that, you know, you can kind of try to enlighten people and not only spread knowledge, but I think empathy is very important. You know, to help people to walk in other shoes, I mean, is I think key in a lot of ways, because then they can relate to that person more. You know, they can put themselves in you know, in their position through, you know, trying to feel what they might be feeling, or at least get an inkling of what they might be feeling and what led them to, you know, certain places in their life. And so I think it can be a very powerful medium, as long as your aim is truth and trying to get beyond superficial, you know, a superficial presentation of things. And, you know, just sound bites, you know, they have their place, you know. I mean, this is different than a news piece, and that has its place as long as they're telling the facts. I mean, we've seen a lot of that in, you know, the Trump era and, you know, with, you know, in the pandemic. And, you know, so much harm can be done by skewing the facts or just, you know, not being honest with what's really going on, but trying to make money from it or trying to, you know, spread your politics. So. Okay, anything else comes to mind? I appreciate you guys coming out tonight.
I have a question.
Okay.
4 people remain, came here, and at the end of the pandemic, I'm curious, what prompted you all to come to this? How did you decide to take this time out of your life and come here to the United States? If you don't mind saying.
I'm taking an Indians of North America class, so I'm about
Did you learn anything new?
I did actually, the peacemaking thing was new, but I was just wondering too, because we talked about it in my class, how Native Americans like influenced the Constitution and stuff. Did anybody mention that when you were making the documentary? Like that their history, you know, kind of drove them to be lawyers?
I've heard that myself. I don't know, you probably know more details about it than I do, but I think that the way they're speaking about Native American values and tribal, you know, the seven grandfather teachings, I think you can see how that would relate to the Constitution.
Yeah.
You know, those deep-seated values whereby they, you know, arrange their culture really, you know, and ceremony and how they interacted with one another. You know, that they, you know, they try to aim for this ideal, you know, these ideals and values. I mean, you know, we all fall short, and certainly tribal communities, you know, aren't perfect and all that, but, the fact that they aim for that, it's so out, you know, it's so present in their communities, you know, that most of the, tribal citizens of a community are going to know about those things, you know. Did you know about the boarding schools? Was that taught in your class?
Vaguely, I think that's one of our options for our report, but a question for that too is, what was the, like, so I get that the kids were taken away, but like, what was the cause? What was like the reason for them to be taken away from their families? What was justified?
Yes, well, the notion was that, the federal government felt that they needed to be, like assimilated, incorporated into mainstream society. And also, and I think as a way to disempower them. I mean, really, because the boarding schools, what they did was they broke up communities, and there are times where they took, let's say, kids from, and brought them to, you know, a school in, you know, Pennsylvania. I mean, Michigan had a couple boarding schools, so maybe they
Mount
did.
Pleasant had a huge
Yeah.
boarding school. And it was after the attempt to exterminate, we had a period of not conquest. After the attempt to exterminate Indians as a force in the land, so that the land was open to homestead, to be taken by majority culture. The problem remained that there were still these survivors, and they were a threat. They were viewed, their culture was viewed as a threat. Speaking their language, white people justly feared these people whom they had so grievously harmed. To me, it's amazing when I interact with people like Mike Petoskey and Ali, Carrie Whitman is someone who's very special to me. It's amazing to me. I feel the same way I felt when I went to Zimbabwe, and I went to the state capital in Harare. I went to the state Supreme Court, and I asked these guards with AK-47s if I could take a peek. And I said, I'm a lawyer from the United States. And they said, oh, well, yes, of course. And they, with their machine guns, they took me to the Supreme Court and let me view the chambers and see the place. And I thought, how strange that they don't hate me just to look at me after what Brits did to them. I look just like them. How strange that these people can be so calm and so kind, and that their culture has survived. This tells you something about the strength of the values that they've preserved, managed to preserve. These values, these 7 values, that love is somehow, and honesty and loyalty, the values that they still espouse, that have survived this attempt to exterminate their country. That's what the boarding schools were. It was an attempt to exterminate the language, exterminate the culture, and exterminate the people. Make them blend into and disappear into the great. This was the theory. They're really, Indian history is very complicated. Congress's relationship to Indian people is very complicated, but this final phase of trusteeship that Matt Fletcher, who was on our scholarship committee, brilliant man. I love to watch him speak because he's always got cups and stick to tobacco juice. Tobacco is very sacred to Indian people, and he uses it constantly. He said, yeah, they broke all their promises at one time or another, but it's important to remember they also killed some of them. And it's important for us to remember that we can keep some of them. Now, the attitude of the It's not uniform. The attitude is we will recognize tribes, when they organize, when they demonstrate that they are in fact tribal entities, we will recognize them, we will give them sovereign power, and we will set them off on their own to exercise that power. And the tribes that dig deep within themselves and create, I love to go to an Indian casino and pay something back, because I lose. But I don't mind, because I know what they're gonna do with that money. They have jobs, they have a whole society that they're building with that money, and good health, education, and so on. But they're not rich. Ali Maldonado, I told the story to you earlier, was leaving to go to law school. She had a full scholarship, tuition scholarship to Georgetown, good law school. And she was packing her car, and she said, I didn't worry about going to law school, but I had no place to live. I was going to live in my car. And I went to the mailbox, and I found your check from the Wilker Foundation. And that enabled me to rent an apartment and have a place to live while I studied. And your support every year enabled me to live while I studied. And that's the difference that we could make. Because they're not rich, just because they have casinos. This has just been a way for them to reassemble their culture. And it makes me very happy that they have this means of doing that. John Wilker said, we said, aren't you worried about funding a Native American scholarship? Because at that time there was a great conflict between gillnet fishing Indians and sport fishing, who claimed the Indians were depleting the fish population. And he said, because he was known for his fly fishing stories too. Trout Madness is one of the most famous of the outdoor writing books that he did. And he said, if they don't like it, then read the book. And he was talking about laughing whitefish. He was talking about what we had done. How dishonest we were with Indians. So he knew what was just. He knew what was needed.
But I think economic power, economic control or advantage is another thing that you see how important that is, and where that can lead you, how empowered that can lead a community if the values are there, But I think it's wonderful that you're taking a class on Native Americans and the issues. It's nice to hear that exists.
Yeah.
So, thank you for your questions. Anybody else want to share what made them come today? And
Excuse me, I'm Uncle Barkley. My convictions, aside from my strong convictions for justice for the dispossessed and oppressed, I too am in this course. And just a remark, for my term paper, I'm focusing on two-spirited individuals, and it is really beautiful, just the sense of holism just throughout any just culture, whether it's through justice or the notions that, like some atomized idea of sex and gender and everything being separate entities, but all interconnected parts of a greater whole. It's really fascinating. So that remains like all domains of indigenous life.
yes, that sounds fascinating.
Right after it does.
That
I'm
sounds,
sorry, I speak. I'm rarely intelligible. I'm sorry.
that's okay. I got I heard most of it. So, well, that sounds fascinating, and it's heartwarming to hear that students are maybe more students are coming to see justice as a something to be involved with. Again, I think during the pandemic, that's kind of risen up. We see Black Lives Matter coming to the forefront, and you also see, I mean, I think we saw during the protests, whites and blacks coming together, African Americans and Caucasian people coming together to try to, begin that protest and that, just shaking it up and really trying to start to change things. So I think that that's a wave that we might see continue. So, anybody else want to share why they,
Okay, outside of health and movements, kind of similar to him, I remember in high school, they didn't really talk much about America's history of Native Americans other than like way back in the past. Like, they don't really talk about current issues as much. So just recently, I learned more like those news articles at the beginning of this year, kind of with the what's it called? The residential schools, all
Yes.
the horrifying things that happen there.
that's
Yeah.
boarding schools, yeah.
Yeah, learning about that was horrifying. Also
When the
about
children were found dead on the buried,
yeah,
right, that's what you're speaking of,
yeah,
yes.
yeah. That was and current issues the Lyme disease stuff that's going on. That kind of sparked more interest in looking into kind of issues.
Yeah, it's wonderful. I mean, it's good to hear that interest is there, and a lot of times you can see it in the college, age groups, and I mean, history, lots of protests and change, I think, happened because youth, really are becoming more engaged. So, does that sum it up, or any last
I
comments?
really need to hit the road. I came all the way from that very early morning. So I want to thank you for putting this together.
Yes, thank you so much.
I think you all.
Thank you all for coming out.
I think this film is wonderful, and Roger,
Thank you, Fred.
again, congratulations. And I hope people will watch it. Enjoy the Q&A. Thank you.
Get home safely.
Thanks for wrapping this up, Fred.
All right.
And can we,
I'm just obeying my wife, sent me a text.
come home.